Okay with that recommendation? Okay. All right, so next, moving on to goal 3, which focuses on the commitment to fiscal responsibility. Objective 3.1, to align the budget to priorities and seek alternate revenue sources. And there are several initiatives listed under here that I won't read out to my committee members, but want to open the floor for any discussion or questions about any of the initiatives listed, as well as any of the accountability partners and timeline or time metrics associated with initiatives.
Chairman Mackey?
Yes.
First, I apologize for being late. I'll let you know my previous meeting ran long. For my information, what page are we on?
We are on page 39 of 58.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go first. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. No, please.
I guess this was more of a question for staff while we look at some of these initiatives. We have initiative number 2 about centralizing grants creation and administration into one department with a central point of contact for communicating projects, priorities, initiatives, etc. Is this something different than work that is done in the community development department? When we say creating one department, can you provide, I guess, more detail into what you mean by that, or what the initiative?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Ask a follow-up question on that. I'm not sure how you're going to answer that question, but as part of it, it would be helpful for me if you said, this is what we have today, and then this is what you were seeing moving forward and what those efficiencies would be. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Currently in our structure, we do have the Community Development Office, which is where the Community Block Development grants and many of the other grants that are centered around community development are housed. However, there are other grants and other departments that do have individuals who seek grants. And while some of the elected officials, especially the Sheriff's Department, does a great job and they're very specialized in those things, the idea with this is that the new division would be a centralized grants department where we would have conservation, your CDGB, community development, and other grants that aren't really community-based grants that may provide services and opportunities throughout the county, for instance, emergency services and things of that nature. So we believe that by housing those all in one place with a clearinghouse and one person responsible for making sure that the proper regulations are followed to secure the grant funding and that we're not liable for any funds that we may receive at a later date because of non-compliance, we'd be better served by having that as an opportunity.
Yes.
As a follow-up to that, so it is correct that there are many grants. So let me just pick a random grant to understand if that would be included there. So as we look at our CDBG funding, for example, would that then come to be housed in the same place that looks at our HTAX and ATAX grants, for example?
That is a consideration. HTAX and ATAX are a little more unique. And because those are grants that actually we administer to other people. And while we're very focused on ensuring that those grants are administered appropriately and in accordance with council's will, we're even more concerned about making sure that we're compliant with requirements for the federal government, for state governments, and for others who actually issue grants to the county, for instance, your CDGB, and to make sure that we don't really forfeit funds that we have access to by not using them quickly enough.
So it would be, for different example, might be funding ARPA funding or other funding where Richland County is the recipient. The idea is to house all those together.
Yes, ma'am, that is the idea.
Mr. Livingston?
I think my question is kind of similar to that one. That is, it's trying to separate the competitive grants from the ones that are allocated, for example, for example, a lot of some of the sheriff department grants are, are grants that they apply for, and they're kind of competitive. What CDBG is funds we just get,
Yes, sir. Now, as I said, some of the elected officials have staff members that do those. They're specifically geared toward, for instance, law enforcement, and that's all they're looking for. We're just trying to make certain that we're able to access all the grants that the county may be eligible for, having specific individuals that would be looking for additional grants that we may be missing out for. Doesn't necessarily have to be competitive. They could be competitive. It could just be allocations, but anything where we actually have a compliance piece to be certain that we're spending funds appropriately and checking all the boxes to make sure that we haven't left anything that's not appropriately done from a compliance perspective.
That was my concern. I just a lot of effort towards.
Yes, sir.
And so when we talk about creating a new department and we look at accountability or ownership, does that include the community development department now?
The plan would be that most of those individuals, because they do deal with grants, may become a part of that department. We haven't completely formed that structure yet, but if you recall in our budget presentation this year, we did recommend that we move to form a grants department.
Okay, so I guess I'm looking under accountability and ownership. Would they fall under finance and budget as well as other required departments? Would they be there or?
No, ma'am. They would actually be a department of their own standing.
Okay,
So we would be a
need to
grants
add
department.
them. No, I guess community development. Do they fall under as other required departments, or do we need to list them out as?
They would be as other required departments, which once we're finished with the budget process and we have a more formalized structure, we'd be able to determine where all the players would align.
And then is this something that you're envisioning can happen in a year? Is that why we're saying in FY 2023? Am I reading it correctly?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Ms. Newton.
My question is about something else. So if yours is on this topic, Mr. Livingston, I'm happy to yield.
My main point I was trying to make is I don't want the grants department to just be focused on just managing grants. I want to be focused on seeking grants.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, Mr. Livingston. That's one of the focuses of developing a department specific to that so that we can address those areas that we are not currently focusing on. Right now, we're just trying to manage the house. So we are interested in moving forward, and your question will be answered within the formation of a department that adds grant writers to it. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Newton.
Thank you. So first, I have a general question, and I maybe knew this the last committee meeting, but I was unclear when I was reading the packet. So as we look at how this is set up, we have our objectives and then we have our initiatives. And as I read this document, there were some very granular initiatives that I don't recall coming from council, which is fine. I just want to clarify from my perspective if the things that I'm looking at here in the initiatives generally represent staff's efforts to make some proposals to address those broader goals, or if it's a combination.
It's mine, and staff, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that it is a combination. So it is information taken from the retreat where we went around the round tables and folks gave feedback. And remember, in those round tables, there was a mix of council and staff.
Thank you. And then I guess I have a question on 3.2, but the last thing that I would say or ask on 3.1 in terms of reviewing and updating the procurement ordinance, just to confirm, my understanding is that some of that process was already underway, or maybe it wasn't updating the ordinance, but rather updating our policies. Could you address if my perception is correct that some of this work was already underway?
Your perception is correct. We're just formalizing some of the things so that we have the ability to be accountable for them and to track them so that we don't just talk about kind of things that were happening. Yes,
Sure.
ma'am, you are correct.
I wholeheartedly endorse that item. So thank you. And then whenever we get to 3.2, I have a question then.
Under 3.1, the implement a performance-based budgeting process. Can I just have a little bit more information on what that looks like and who are the parties involved?
Sure. So some of that is what we are trying, we're piecemealing that right now throughout our processes. But what we want to actually do is, because it's sort of a huge leap, to be honest with you, how people look at their budgets now. When we talk about that process and start talking about what that looks like. So what we're doing right now is we're trying to implement steps. So one of the first steps, in addition to the strategic planning process and the initiatives, would be then to go back and communicate going forward. Here is what we're looking to do. We're looking to do a performance-based budget that looks at how your year ended out, what elements within that year affected how it looked, so that as you go forward to this next year, we are focusing on those areas that have been prioritized and that are critical to the work that you are doing, rather than just things that we have traditionally done with funds that we have. So it's part of it. It is the conversation that we're having, but more formally, it is adopting the stance that we're moving in that direction, and then is to begin to put in different measures that say, here's what that looks like. So we don't expect we would go from yesterday to tomorrow and it's performance-based, because we're going to have people who don't even really know what we're talking about in terms of how does that look? What do you mean I am performing? We are doing a job. And so it's going to be a talking about, a putting tools there, and then adopting those tools as requirements rather than initiatives and encouragements. And right now we are in the initiatives and encouragement phase of implementing a performance-based budget. So that's not a zero balance budget for anybody that's listening saying, oh my goodness, they're going to make us prove everything we need. But it is looking at the core elements of the work that you're required to do, how well we do those things, and how well the resources that we provide allow you to do those things. And yes, it may require us looking at some things that are not associated with what we do as a part of that. So we are really in the couching phase of that right now, members of council, Ms. Mackey. That's why it's not as hard, cut, and fast, because we're not in an environment where we can make it hard, cut, and fast. So we're talking about what it's going to look like, and we're hoping by adopting this, that will show that the council is interested in moving to a process where departments need to think about that more than just how much money you gave me last year.
And then with each of the initiatives listed for objective 3.1, is there any sequential order that they need to be in order for them to be successful? And is that shown here, or have we just listed them here? So when we look at timeline and how it works, most of this, beginnings, most of them say 2023. Is there, I'm just going to stop there.
Yeah, they're probably, so this is not necessarily in sequential order, in a sense that it lines out a chart that you could track. So I can certainly see value in doing that. So we should go back and do that. But there are probably a few things in here that it would make better sense for us to do in an orderly fashion. There are some, but they're not necessarily dependent variables on each other.
All right, moving to 3.2. Ms. Newton.
Yes, I'm not quite sure how to ask this question. So the first item that is listed is to develop an accurate model for revenue projections, which leads me to ask, what type of model are we using now, and what what is the difference that you see or propose? Could you address that?
So I'm not going to get myself in trouble, but what I will say just in general, I'm just saying in terms of being professional with the folks that do that, is we would like to get to a point to where the last budget process that we've gone through, we've talked to departments about looking at their previous budgets and saying, here's kind of what you spent. And we've also given you projections as a council as to what we believe revenue looks like. What we want to be able to do is do a better job of forecasting. And that's really what we're saying. We want to put something in place where we do a better job of forecasting revenues than we've had, so that there's not wild swings between how much money we didn't spend and how much money we thought was available. But I'll let Lori speak to any details of the, if there's a system or something that we're going to put in place. So Lori, if you will address the committee, please.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you, committee. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. So no, ma'am, we're not just guessing.
I didn't think so. We might just want to revise the language. I just thought
Yes, I will.
It did beg the question.
Thank you. No, we have been using historical forecasts to make those projections. And they've typically come out of the budget and finance departments. What we'd like to do is to make it more interactive so that we're actually using departments' input to help us to recognize what revenue streams may be there, and how they may impact our future spending. We'd also like to get to a point where we're forecasting the revenues further in advance. And then making adjustments as we move forward with that. So it's more about making it a process that's perpetual than just an annual process. We'd also like to have, the conversations related to the departments where we're looking at changes. A good, for instance, of it is, if you recall, the recession of 2008, probably one of the first indicators that we saw in local government was that we started to see housing permit numbers go down. So those are the best places that we can start to get that kind of information. So it's going to become a more interactive dialogue. And I'm happy to answer any other questions you may have.
That answers my question. And then I guess I have a question for my colleagues. As I looked at this objective, and I don't want to insert something that's not really coming from council, so I just want to raise a question for our consideration. One of the things that this objective made me ponder is if the county has a posture regarding public-private partnerships. Now, a lot of these objectives that you see in 3.1 are more internal in terms of looking at our processes, but as you look at evaluating alternate sources of funding that can address some of our priorities, public-private partnerships can sometimes be a solution. And so I just raised that for our consideration. It might not make sense to have that conversation here. Maybe we want to have it at another time, and certainly don't want some blanket policy that we always do it, but just expanding beyond our internal operations. There are a lot of objectives in here that I feel quite sure we don't have enough money for by ourselves. So I wanted to raise that for thought. Thank you.
Oh, I'm an advocate of looking at opportunities for public-private partnerships.
I will say that I agree as well. And I would think that under the initiative for explore alternative funding resources, that looking at public-private partnerships would be something that we're doing. So I would say that the committee agrees with that.
Sure, and maybe we just add a comma where appropriate, just to.
Got that edit? Okay. All right, anything else for 3.2? I will say I did the objective itself, 3.2, assess necessary resources, didn't really say anything to me. So I'm not sure. I get the initiatives. I'm not sure if the wording for the objective is clear or speaks to what is happening. or what we would like to happen for that goal or for that objective. Anything else for 3.2? Right, so establish a clear process for vetting projects, including establishing facility priorities and determining financial resources aligning with 5-year plan. Where is the 5-year plan that we're referencing? Does that exist, or are we going to create the plan with this initiative?
Madam Chair, while we do have a capital plan, in many instances, it's more of a wish list. So we will be establishing a full 5-year CIP plan that would have allocated resources as well.
Follow up on that.
Yes, ma'am.
So as part of what budget process would that happen? Would that be part of this budget process, or is that something that you see next fiscal year?
For capital improvements, we will have a process this year, but this part will probably be next year before it's implemented.
Okay, thank you.
So for that one, can we just add something in there that spells out the CIP? So that's clear what that is. 3.3, balance budget with projects that do not affect the minimum thresholds. The first one, defining thresholds for debt, bond coverage, fund balances, etc. Are these already not defined? That is the question.
So some of these things, yes. The short answer is yes.
So under this initiative, I mean, are we updating? Because if they're already defined, what exactly are we doing on this initiative?
I think the second part of the question is what they'll be working on to align it with the best practices.
I think that's kind of where we're going.
Okay.
Is we're trying to look to not only have the thresholds that are set that we have, but to Mr. Livingston's quick assessment, is align those to what the best practices are. So let everybody be clear. Richland County is doing a very good job of staying within all thresholds, meeting all compliance thresholds associated with this area. But we want to take it to the next level. And we've done a good job being at the level we are. We just want to continue to improve.
Okay, I'm recognized. And so one of the questions that I had on this, Mr. Brown, is, or maybe it's for my colleagues, is do you feel like you need some sort of affirmative statement or, statement of values from council that we want to adhere to these guidelines? Because some of them are requirements. As you look at the first part, those are the ones that fall in your more legal realm. But in terms of limits on fund balance use, that's something that can exist in the strategic plan. But do you require something additional from us that provides support? And like I said, an affirmative agreement that this is something that we want to do moving forward.
That's a good way to say it's a good statement. We would be looking for a council to communicate that in the form of could be inclusive of the strategic plan, can be included in the budget document, but an affirmative communication that here is what we believe to be how we are going to meet these thresholds, exceed these, or how we're going to use our policy making to create. There's a word I'm trying to use. I'm trying not to write it for you right now, Ms. Newton, but yes.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
You don't have to write it.
That's what we need council to do that, because then it goes beyond just a staff recommendation, a staff goal. It becomes a way of life for Richland County operations.
Okay.
Any other comments under 3.3? Right, so the third initiative about establish a performance-based budgeting process for departments, is that different from what is already included in Objective 3.1 initiative?
No, ma'am. I think it's close to the same, but I think one is saying it's acknowledging we're implementing it, so it's not already done. And the other one is establishing it so that we go from putting something in place that we walk away from to we are actually going to build on that. So if it doesn't start the way we want it, that doesn't mean that's where it stops, that we establish it as the method that we're going to use for the budget process until we decide as a council that we're not.
Any thoughts from committees about that initiative staying where it is?
Actually, I guess I'll just say this. One of the challenges when you're looking at a document that is so long is that some of the things do overlap. And so as I was reviewing this, I kind of said, I hope that somebody will go through this with a fine tooth comb and say, okay, well, this is currently represented in 3 parts, or this is currently represented in 2 parts, just because I don't have a problem with it here, but nor can I say that it doesn't exist somewhere else down the road as well.
And we can remove any duplicity. If we feel like that one actually does a better job than the one-liner, it doesn't hurt us to just roll what we believe into that. So we'll just make that as a note if that's okay with the committee as you see here. Perfect.
Yes, I think so. Okay, so that is all for goal 3. Ms. Newt, I know you were a few minutes late, so I wanted to highlight goal 2. We quickly hit on that. There was some economic development questions that were brought up in our last session. And I directed staff to look at the current economic development plan that is in place out of the Economic Development Office. That includes some language for marketing and some other teaming and partnership efforts, and use that with some of this initiative so that we're not recreating work that is already taking place out of the Economic Development Office. And so wanted to give you an opportunity, if you had anything else you wanted to state for goal 2, we do have staff here from the Economic Development Office if you have anything else.
I think I'll take mine offline. I think I asked questions last time about this developing more shopping and amenity options, because I'm not sure that I recall that as a will of full council, as opposed to, a suggestion that came, maybe from. I completely fine having better shopping and amenities and think we need it. I just think that economic development is a really broad thing. And so some of these stated goals feel more narrow to me than what I would personally like to pursue, but I can take that as part of a separate conversation.
Okay. So any other comments or thoughts? We have goal 4. Ready for me to start? Or okay, great.
Ready for me to talk about.
The main thing popped up when I was looking at
Hold on,
4,
Mr. I just want to confirm if everybody can hear Mr. Livingston. Okay.
just in case.
Thank you.
Based on 4, what the first thing popped up in my mind based on what's currently going on with our land use plan, and that is something about our communicating to the public in this area in terms of if we're going to talk about establishing plans, success metrics for smart growth, we need to figure out a way how we're going to engage and make sure we inform the public is aware somehow. We got to put that in there somewhere.
And that could potentially also go in goal 5, but I mean, it won't hurt my feelings if it's here too. But really maybe
at least a statement about it and go, I don't want to get lost in 4. I mean, but that's the issue with
Mr. Livingston, if I could potentially put words in your mouth or amplify it, I think there's one thing that's communication to the public. And then there's another thing that's engagement with the public where they communicate to us. And so I'd like to see both of those covered.
It could possibly go somewhere else. It just came up when I got to that point.
All right, so I had a question regarding The initiative under objective 4.1, the biannual review and update the county's SLBE capture area to make sure there's sufficient contractual competition. It's currently at a 25-mile radius. And so I guess I want to kind of figure out, when we look at timeline and metrics, one, what is the time frame now? Are we doing that annually now, or what is the current time frame? And then when will we believe to be able to implement this? Is we're saying implement it starting in 2025? Is that what this is proposing?
I was trying to ask the county attorney at the time if he could recall in our ordinance related to SLBEs, because I know there was some question about how we determine small businesses. And I think there was some language in there that talked about us reviewing that we could, but I don't think there's a specific requirement. So I was trying to make sure I didn't misspeak on that. But I believe that this is talking about 2025. But again, to your earlier comment, but it was Ms. Newton's, there are some things that we're already doing as we're trying to move forward with. And the SLBE, or the Office of Small Business, is one of those areas that we were already working on before we started trying to look at prioritizing the strategic plan. So that's something that we already are looking at and actually have been, because we have to determine when organizations roll off for being a small business. So that, and the county has the ability to look and to change that. And the reason why I'm talking this way is because I know we just did something like this with a business, and they were referring to the ordinance, and we were saying, no, the ordinance, it's not a requirement that we do that. The county has the ability to do that. And that's something we were trying to deal with. So I will go back and do a better job, Ms. Mackey, on this particular area, just to clarify, tell you where we are with that, and then come back and tell you whether or not 2 years means starting here to 2025 or starting in 2025, so that we can make sure we get this part right. But I would just say there's something going on right now associated with the Office of Small Business and small local businesses in Richland County. And we're looking at all those things.
And did the 2-year mark, is that like a best practice? Do we know where that time frame came from?
I don't right offhand, Ms. Mackey.
Okay. All right. Objective 4.2, coordinate department.
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
I didn't see any. I didn't see anybody. Okay. Go ahead, Ms. Newton.
I was letting you go.
Okay.
So, first, let me say that I don't want to, unless we need to, engage in a long wordsmithing exercise here from the dais. But there are some nuances of language that I don't know if they are captured here. So when we talk about a word like growth, let me kind of put two things on different sides. On the one hand, we might talk about something like economic growth, which is something that people generally perceive as positive. And then you may talk about other types of growth as you look at our communities, as you look at housing, where different communities may feel different ways. And so I understand that we're trying to be more specific as we talk about smart growth or controlled growth, et cetera. But I guess I can have a separate conversation. I want to look at some of this language, because we understand that growth is going to happen, and we want to make sure that it happens in a way that is both profitable for the county, but also for the citizens. But just to make sure that it doesn't look like we're necessarily trying to make things grow. It's hard to talk about. Like I said, there's that positive economic growth. But for example, we're not trying to make communities burst at the seams, for example. That's not the type of growth that we're talking about promoting here. So I think we need to be really careful with how we talk about some of these things to make sure that we don't accidentally give that perception that that's what we're trying to do, that instead, as we look at controlled growth, as is here, we're trying to say, how can we make sure that we are providing the right infrastructure that we need? How can we make sure that we're having the right processes that we need as we look at evaluating these things? So I guess there's just some of the language here that just made me feel a little uncomfortable that I would like for us to look at. And I can have that conversation with whoever the appropriate person is. So for example, if you look at the objective, establish plans and metrics that enable smart growth. And it's fine. I don't want to wordsmith. Is it really that you're talking about supporting the smart growth? Because we're not trying to push, but we're looking at, where things are, and there may be, priority areas where we want to make investments, but we're really supporting it as opposed to pushing our thumb down on the scales, if that makes sense, what I'm trying to say. But I did have a question. One thing here that's not here that I think needs to be is looking at collaboration. I can't speak for everyone, but if you look at the major roads in my area, a lot of those roads are DOT roads. I also have, some reverse, what are they called? Donut holes where I have people who are in the city surrounded by the county. And so I think we need to look at who are the partners that we would need to collaborate with to make this happen, particularly as it relates to infrastructure. And then I wasn't clear what this holistic diversity study would mean as it relates to this goal. So if someone could clarify that.
I think the short answer is that there is equity in how we provide resources that support the community.
Okay. Yeah. The way that I know what all those individual words mean, but the way they came together did not indicate a clear path for me. So I guess, again, I think we put this in our values, but if we didn't, then I would just ask us to revisit it again. That I feel like I heard very strongly at our council retreat, a desire, to your point, to make sure that we are providing resources equitably across the county, to make sure that we're not neglecting areas. So as we look at these initiatives, and maybe this is the intent of the diversity study, but it's something that requires, I think could have a metric associated with it. How do we know that we're providing those things, equitably? Because, we can study it, but what are we going to use as criteria? I think that's something we might want to consider. And if you're ready for 4.2, I just have one point that I can.
Mr. Livingston, do you have anything else? 4.1, you're good. All right, Ms. Newton, your 1 point for 4.2.
Out my 1 point right now. Anyway, as you look at the objective 4.2, coordinate departments to prepare for planned growth in areas. I don't know if the word is planned or if the word is anticipated, because again, there's some things that we know and there's some things that we plan. There are other things that other parties are really driving that we're anticipating. Again, just trying to distinguish between those things that we're doing so that it doesn't look like, again, we're putting our thumb on the scale versus things that, we're looking at the horizon and we anticipate. That's it, Ms. Mackey.
Thank you. So we are in the middle of goal 4, and usually I wouldn't do this, but we have a large meeting at 6 with several guests, and I want to be able to give our staff enough time to turn the room over and do what they need to do. So if committee members are okay, I would ask that we adjourn. We are meeting again on Thursday, and believe that's a 2-hour meeting, and believe that we can push through the rest of this document if you all feel good about that, and hopefully we can wrap it up.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Clark?
Mackey,
Yes.
Livingston,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.